Hello plant lovers, welcome to my channel. Thank you for finding me. I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers. They're either indoors or they're outdoors or they're out of the pool. So if that sounds of any use to you, if your climate is a bit similar to mine, do hit subscribe. I post every week. I'm a complete amateur. Take everything, I would say, with a pinch of salt. But I did start this channel really because I found it so hard to find information about growing orchids in my kind of environment, in my kind of climate. So here we are, the benefit of my 3-ish years of struggling through the dark, windy roads of orchid growing, which lands us quite appropriately with one of the most common questions that people either ask or leave as a comment. What fertilizer do you use? Ta-da! Ladies and gentlemen, plant lovers, we're going to talk about the fertilizers I use with my orchids. So what I'm going to do is go through the different types of fertilizers I use and the times when I would use them in the plant's sort of life cycle and season, and then give some specific examples of orchid types that I use per fertilizer. First, caveat, asterisk. This isn't the only way to fertilize plants, or the best way, or a particularly good way. All I will say is that this is what I do in my environment and what I have figured out works for me. Wherever you are, it will be very different depending on your climate, the type of orchids you grow, and the type of potting setup that you've got. So it's all about trial and error, I guess. So what I'm going to share today is what I figured out that works for me, because I wouldn't say I'm a lazy orchid grower, but I'm pretty low maintenance and a low maintenance feeder. Well, all right, let's dive in at the very beginning and let's look at the type of fertilizers I use. Again, there'll be other things out in the marketplace. Now, I am just showing you these brands because they happen to be the brands I have. I'm not recommending them or suggesting you hunt them down either. It's all about finding what works for you in your region. So there are a couple of basic types of fertilizer that we can start to look at the beginning. So I'm going to clear the decks and we'll go through them one by one. But first, are there any general hard and fast rules for orchid fertilizing? Well, here we go. Here are mine. Again, I'm not putting this in writing and feel free to disregard it. Depends entirely on your climate, the type of orchids you grow, etc., etc. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, fertilize your orchids when they're growing and don't when they're not. So what that means is in the growing season, when your orchid is putting up new growths, new vegetative growths, that's when it's going to be using lots of energy and will require all the help that it can get. If your orchid has a downtime, a rest season, or a period where it's not really growing much, it's sort of in stasis, then that's the time when orchids don't need fertilizer, and often they don't need much water either. But there are some orchids that grow all year, so you just have to balance that. But a good rule of thumb would be, in colder weather, really eliminate it or dial it right down, depending on the orchid type. And in warmer weather, when it's growing and doing its massive, wonderful thing, that is when you want to fertilize things. Before we do that, though, why don't we just talk about why do you need to fertilize your orchids in the first place, which might seem like an odd statement, but there are some people that religiously swear by the fact that they don't ever feed their orchids. So let's look a little bit at the chemistry, very simply, because I am not the person to go to for chemistry, physics, or mathematics, in fact. But anyway, basically, in a nutshell, there are usually 3 key components to any kind of plant fertilizer, really, and they are nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And those are sort of the 3 most important elements that plants need for healthy growth. There are lots of other trace elements and minerals and other things that a plant needs, but those are the 3 key things which you will find generally referred to on fertilizers as NKP. And they are the chemical letters that represent each of those 3 types of element: phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium. N being nitrogen, P being phosphorus, K being potassium. So each of those 3 things does something slightly different, but obviously a general mix of everything, like us, a healthy balanced diet is going to be what your plant needs. Down the track, we'll look at things that are heavier in one particular type of those 3 elements and for what reason. But right now, let's just understand that those 3 things, all of them are generally important for the everyday health of your plant, which is in a pot and can't sort of hunt and gather for itself, with the help of its mycorrhizal friends, which actually help plants extract nutrients from the soil and make it available for the roots of your plant. So in pot culture, we have got to provide the nutrients and hopefully those symbiotic fungi that actually help the plant access those nutrients. So what do those three things do? Well, in a nutshell, we could say that the N of the NPK, which is nitrogen, is largely about healthy leaf growth. The P of NPK, which is phosphorus, is interesting in that phosphorus promotes healthy cell multiplication. So phosphorus is really important for root tip growth and plant tip growth, but also the general health and well-being of the plant. So all of that sort of cellular growth, which is vegetative growth, which as we know is very important for orchids because they will often only flower on a new growth. And the K of NPK is potassium, and that is what promotes fruiting and flowering in plants. So there you go. Those are the three sort of basic elements that are in most fertilizers and that flowering plants particularly need. All right, now we can get back to our basics and start with the types of fertilizers that are commonly out there. Again, with the caveat, these are just the ones that I use. So first cab off the rank is this one, which is a generic slow release fertilizer. And what that means is that your fertilizer is in pellets like that. What you must have is a Georgian silver teaspoon. I'm joking. So there we can see, and I'll come in and show you closely, they're like mustard seeds. And this coating of the little bead is actually reactant to heat. So what slow release fertilizers do is they react to the ambient heat of the potting medium that they are in, and they gradually release the nutrients in that little shell. So slow release, general fertilizers. Now again, I just happen to use this brand. Wherever you are in the world, there'll be a similar generic slow release fertilizer brand. Now the important thing is to notice that this isn't orchid specific, but it does have an NPK little logo there, which tells you the amount of those three key elements that are in this mix. But this is a general fertilizer you could use on any sort of plant. Asterisks. But not for cacti. There are certain things that you don't want to use a generic fertilizer for anyway, but let's not go down that path. We'll just stick in our lane, which is orchids. General plant fertilizer, very useful. So let's carry on with the general fertilizer theme and exhibit B, which is this. Now this brand is called Charlie Carp. Now apologies to my vegan and vegetarian friends out there. I'm a pescatarian, so this is fish based, so it kind of works for me. But anyway, bit of a backstory about this though is that European carp were introduced to Australia foolishly. It's a freshwater fish, and it's particularly now as our climate is changing and warming up, it breeds in a much faster cycle than our native freshwater fish and has basically eliminated or caused the elimination of a lot of native freshwater fish species. So it's a real problem in our waterways. And so every year there's a huge number of European carp removed from our river systems, and vegans and vegetarians block your ears. They are basically liquidized and turned into a general plant fertilizer. Now my grandmother used to use something called blood and bone, which is just basically very similar. It's essentially an animal byproduct. So yeah, if you are a vegan or a vegetarian, there are other things that we can do and get to. So I hope this isn't going to outrage or offend you too much. So this is an Australian brand. Now obviously the European carp issue is very specific to Australia, but wherever you are in the world, I'm sure there is going to be an animal-based fertilizer as well, which is perhaps called blood and bone or whatever it might be. This is a general fertilizer again, and it does contain, which all of these products should, a little table at the back which tells you the amount of those three elements that we just talked about. So this contains both nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, slightly heavier on the nitrogen end, so slightly more about vegetative leafy growth, but nonetheless a general fertilizer. Okay, the next cab off the rank for our vegan and vegetarian friends, hopefully, is this. Now, this is not a Nestle protein powder. What this is, plant lovers, is worm juice. Or we could call it worm milk or whatever we might want to say. But essentially, if you've got a worm farm, this is the liquid that comes out of your worm farm. And I have very, very generously been given some of this by our neighbor. When we move into our final house, I will be having a worm farm, plant lovers, because one of the many other things that worms do is eat cotton. So if you've got cotton waste, then a worm farm is great for disposing of cotton clothing waste, etc. naturally. It's fantastic. Anyway, let me show you what this looks like. Let's just pour ourselves a little snifter of worm juice. Here we have our little tumbler of worm juice. What a great year that was. Just need a few ice cubes, dim the lights, have an open fire. Looks like, what does it look like? Guinness? Anyway, now, so here we're going to get a little bit pedantic, that worm juice isn't a fertilizer because it doesn't contain NPK. It doesn't, well, it does contain little bits of those elements, but really it is more of a tonic. So it contains all manner of other wonderful things that plants need for their health and well-being. So it is more of a tonic that you would use for your plants, not as a fertilizer. You can use something like worm juice with a fertilizer that has NPK in it, or not. Now this is something that you would dilute, but we'll get to that later on. We're just going to firstly marvel at the glory that is worm juice, because a lot of people have also asked me about whether you can use it on your orchids. And here I am going to say yes. And since we're on the tonic route, let us now look at this. This brand is called Sea Sol, and perhaps as you can imagine, it is a seaweed-based liquid. And again, it is not a fertilizer because it doesn't contain NPK. Now it might have, again, like our worm juice, traces of it, but again, like worm juice, it contains other wonderful biological juicy things that plants need for general health. So not a fertilizer, but a tonic. Again, it's a liquid, and again, you dilute it, and again, we'll get to that later. Now, this brand happens to be an Australian one. Wherever you are, I am sure there is going to be a seaweed-based plant food, although it's not a food, that you'll be able to find. Which brings us naturally to orchid-specific fertilizers. Which are fertilizers? Here we go. Now, again, there are rafts, myriads of orchid-specific fertilizers out there in the world, wherever you might be. So these are just the ones I happen to get. You can get them online, you can get them from hardware stores, you can get them from nurseries, garden centers. Some florists perhaps might sell them. There are lots out there. And you know, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. A mineral's a mineral's a mineral. An element's an element's an element. Doesn't matter really what package it's in. I guess the only thing to understand is why perhaps they're targeted at different things. So one type of orchid specific fertilizer you might find in the marketplace is bloom specific. Now if we go back and remember NPK, the three things that are most important to plant health and fertilizing well-being, the K refers to flowering. So as we said, there is that NKP chart. I'm just trying to see where it is on here. There we go, actually. The NPK is up there. I was lying to you. And as you can see, the K element of that says it is 25. Whether that's percentile per whatever, who knows. But essentially, it gives you an idea that compared to the others, which are N, nitrogen, 15, P, phosphorus, which is 3, and K, which is potassium, is 25. So in the ratio of this mix, this is very much erring towards potassium, and therefore is going to be giving a plant that is coming into bloom, has got spikes coming, or is in bloom, perhaps what it needs. And then we have a general orchid fertilizer, which is pretty balanced. So we have got our NPK chart on the back, and it's pretty balanced across those three key elements that you need: potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus. So this would just be a general fertilizer for an orchid, and it will benefit the orchid's roots, its leaves, and its blooming capacity. So there you go. Again, the quantities of all of these we'll get to later on. All right, I hope you're keeping up with me. Let's talk quantities now. So general slow release fertilizer. There are two occasions where I use this, but regardless of the occasion, which we'll get to in a minute, I generally use the same amount. So get your Georgian silver teaspoon. I am kidding. You can use whatever you want. I'm just going to try and show you what I use to be really specific. So there we are, and I'll come down and show you exactly what that is. That is literally a pinch. It's sort of 4-ish, 5-ish grains of the slow release fertilizer, which understand is triggered by heat, so it's going to be more active as the temperature warms up. Ergo in spring, perhaps when a plant would need more of its fertilizer available for it, but we'll get to the whens and the whys later on. But in a nutshell, that is what I use, which is not a huge amount of the slow release fertilizer. There are asterisks, occasions when you do use more, but we'll get to that. Okay, next quantity, anything that is a liquid. So that would include our fishy friend, our seaweed friend, and our generic orchid friend here. Anything that is in a liquid form, you need to dilute. Now, I always say in my videos, dilute it more than it tells you on the box or the packet or the container. So here you've got all these complex instructions about the volume of your watering can and blah, blah, blah. 1 capful equals yada, yada, yada. All very useful if you are that kind of person. I perhaps am not. So I don't measure my quantities at all. This is the jug that I use to mix all my fertilizers in. And this is the watering can that I use to water things indoors, not outdoors. And you can see that is quite a small can. So I do the mixing in here and then I decant into here and off we go. There's about 3.5 watering canfuls in this jug. Let me show you how much I put in this of each of the liquid types of fertilizer / tonic that I use. Okay, so here's my very scientific measurement of sea sole, the seaweed solution, and it is, plant lovers, that much. Not much at all. Then we decant into a more charming watering can like thus, and there we go. Here is our vessel, here is our liquid, and it could be any of the liquids that I'm using, seaweed one, the fishy one, or the general orchid fertilizer. I just put in a splash. Now you can measure it, you can use a cap and measure it as you wish, but I just go splosh, that much. Whether it's the seaweed one, the liquid one, whatever it might be. Fill that up with water, give it a good swish around so it's nice and diluted, and then I decant into the watering can and off we go and water my orchid. So it's unscientific. I'm not saying you should do the same thing. I just can't be bothered measuring. I also can't tell you what the volume capacity of this is, whether it's a couple of litres, a few pints, no idea. So I'm not about to spend half an hour figuring out the maths and the ratio quantities. I just put a little dash. So I hope that hasn't outraged you. Then the last quantity is this, which is a powder, which I will show you like that. And again, I'm pretty sparing. I think there's a bit of a philosophy with fertilizers, which in my book is less is better. So it's easy to over fertilize pot plants, and that often doesn't do them many favors. So if I'm using this powder, I use the same beautiful jug, and I will just use the tip of a teaspoon. So that is the amount, and I will show you more closely. So that is the amount that I would use of this soluble fertilizer, and again I will put it in there and I will add water and I will mix it around to make sure that it's dissolved well into the water. I will then decant it into my watering can and water the orchids thus, and as I said, it's about 3.5 canfuls in this jug. So that's what I do. Again, pretty unscientific, and what it does also mean though is that these things do last quite a long time for me, which I think is perhaps either a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because it means I'm not overfeeding my orchids. The bad thing might be that I'm not feeding them enough. Okay, now let's talk context. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. They're just the things that I do for all of my orchids. So whenever I'm repotting something, I always put a soupçon, a dash, and I showed you how much, into the potting medium, whatever it might be. Now, asterisks, sometimes more, sometimes less, but we'll get to specific examples down the track. But in essence, I always put a few grains into the potting mix, no matter what season it is that I'm repotting the orchid, given the proviso that this is heat activated. So if you do it in winter, nothing is really going to happen until spring when the soil warms up and ta-da, your fertilizer is released. And here I have an example of me doing just that. A bit of perlite, a little bit of sphagnum, not too much. There we go. A bit more bark. Then a few grains of our secret ingredient, slow release fertilizer, literally just a few. There we go. There you go. The second usage for this for me is in spring, and I put the same amount again, 3 or 4 grains, on the top of the potting mix of all of my plants as their sort of spring awakening, their spring cocktail hour of gorgeous food. And that is really just to give them the energy they need for the season of growing. Okay, the context for this tonic. This is the seaweed-based tonic, which is not a fertilizer. Now, generally, I use this throughout the warmer season, probably every 3 waterings. And I dilute it, as you saw, very scientifically, and that's it. I just use it as a tonic, as a pick-me-up. So it contains various things which promote the healthy growth and well-being of your plant. It's just not a fertilizer per se. So you can't actually overdo it necessarily because it's not full of those 3 key elements that help the plant grow. So you don't need to be too hung up about any of the measurements. With this, you can be as generous or not as you wish to be. It is quite simply a tonic, and you can use that throughout the season. You can also use it throughout the cooler months, perhaps when some orchids that grow throughout the year, you can use this a little more sparingly with those orchids as well. Now, the other time when I use a seaweed-based solution is when I've just received something in the mail and I give it its first water using that diluted sea salt. I just feel it gives the plant a bit of a lift after the trauma of its journey. Ditto with our little worm juice cocktail. So this is a general tonic, and you would use this in dilution throughout the peak growing season, but you would also use it on plants that do continue to grow throughout the year, that don't have a specific cycle of growth, rest, etc. Now, this one is a fertilizer. This one is the fish-based one, Charlie's Carp. And again, I use this in the warmer seasons or when a plant is in its flush of growth. So often that can be in spring, or it can be when it's in flower, etc., etc. But I tend to use this during the warmer seasons, and again in alternate watering. So again, maybe every 3 or 4 waterings. And then this one, the flowering specific one, have to say, because this is in the bottom of the cupboard and it is a powder that has to be diluted, which to me is just a bit of an extra task. I often actually don't use this, but if I remember it and I've got a few plants in spike, I will use it then. So I only use this when I see the spikes emerging or the blooms are about to open. I tend not to use it on plants where they're open. I feel that the energy's been consumed by that point. So this will provide the plant additional oomph to get the spikes to mature and the flowers to open and be beautiful. So that is when I use this, and that of course could be any time of the year, depends when the plant is in bloom. And then this one again is a fertilizer, so you would use this throughout the growing cycle or with plants that have a growing cycle that's all year in dilution, but generally across the warmer months. And so what you might gather is that there are lots of different options that kind of do the same thing, and I alternate them because I think, you know, like me, I like a varied diet. I like it to be seasonal and fresh. So sometimes I might use this, sometimes I might use this, sometimes I might use this. So it really depends, honestly, which way the wind's blowing. But in the growing season, every 3rd watering generally will contain one of these, whether it's the seaweed-based tonic, whether it's an actual fertilizer in whatever form, or whether it's the worm juice. Generally, every 3 waterings is when I fertilize during the growing seasons. Okay, let's look at some specific examples of plants that you use for all of these different types of foods, tonics, fertilizers, etc. So, our general purpose slow release fertilizer. As I said, I put this in everything at the potting stage. The next thing I do in spring for all of my orchids, look at this cymbidium with its flower spike, is I put a sprinkling of those grains at the top of the plant. And that is for every plant, whether it's something that flowers, regardless of the time it flowers. The quantities will increase depending on the size of the plant. If you've got a massive pot and a massive plant, obviously more than just that means sprinkling. And there are some things where you put a huge amount more in. They are things like catasetum type of orchids, or anything that is sort of a herbaceous perennial that dies down and comes back up. So peony orchids, for example, lots of ground orchids, Phaeus orchids, of which I have one, and these type of orchids that put on huge amounts of vegetative growth in a season and then basically go into complete dormancy and rinse and repeat. So with this type of orchid, for example, you have to repot them every year. So in the mix of this, I would put a lot more of this slow release fertilizer than I would normally, because these plants need huge amounts of energy to grow, to produce a mature pseudobulb and prepare itself for flowering for the next season. So there are some cases where you use a whole lot more of that. All right. Our seaweed-based tonic, and I will also include with this our worm juice, because that is not dissimilar. It's just worms, seaweed, but a tonic that's sort of biological. Now I would use this, and excuse me stretching over. Here we have a very healthy Oncidium. So Oncidiums, Miltaceas, Miltoniopsis, any of those plants that sort of need continual watering all year, perhaps slightly less in winter, but nonetheless continuing watering, because they do often produce 2 spurts of growth. These are the types of plants that I will use something like this all year in dilution, less in winter, but I still feed these sorts of orchids throughout the winter season. So that is particularly Oncidiums, Miltoniopsis and Miltacea, and any of the sort of the mega hybrids, the intergenerics of the Oncidium alliance. And then throughout the year, again, as I said, 1 out of every 3 waterings contains something, whether it's a fertilizer or a tonic, and the seaweed or the worm juice I use on everything. So I'm indiscriminate as to the use of this during those warmer seasons. Okay, now these are the specific fertilizers. So these are the things that have NKP, those very important essential elements that the plant needs to bloom and flower. So these are nutrient-rich fertilizers, and I use those again on everything. Now here's a little Masdevallia. This is a plant type that grows all year round, and it is a plant type that has no pseudobulbs. So that is also very important when it comes to fertilizers. Plants, I think, without pseudobulbs, you need to make sure that there's available nutrition in that medium for them. So plants that grow all year or plants that don't have a pseudobulb will require more regular fertilizer with a fully balanced fertilizer. So with these, I apply this to all of my orchids throughout the growing warmer seasons. And then some things that grow all year, even in winter, I will still use a fertilizer and or a tonic, but obviously in much lower frequencies. So maybe once every 6 weeks, I might give these a little bit of a tonic or a little bit of a fertilizer. Now, the other category that I use those liquid fertilizers for, but also the tonics, but particularly the liquid fertilizers, are orchids like this. Now, I will make a video about this because what can you see there but a flower spike? And I am so excited. This is an Aerides odorata, and I am so looking forward to this opening. Can I tell you, this is the slowest spike in the history of orchid growing to mature. It just takes forever. It's taken months to get that big. We're getting somewhere, but it'll be another few months before it opens, so let's not hold our breath. But the point being, though, like Vandas and any of those sort of monopodial orchid types that are very, very epiphytic and like to grow in baskets, which there are lots of types, but let's think of the Vandas, the Vanda types of orchids. I can't grow those, particularly in Melbourne, because of my climate. I can't just have things hanging with no medium whatsoever. So I pot them very loosely in huge bark so that there's plenty of aeration. So there's not a great deal going on in the medium. So for these types of orchids, which again don't have a pseudobulb, I use liquid fertilizer. Now I do apply that more often. Every 3 waterings, as I said, I put something in that water. Now with this type of orchid, the sort of the Vanda types which have no pseudobulbs, I will often go out of my way to do a special watering of those more often that contains fertilizer. So out of those every 3 waterings, every 3 waterings will generally contain a nutrient rather than a tonic, because they don't really have the capacity in my environment to take up much from the atmosphere, because I can't spray them, nor is there much going on at a medium level. So Anything like that, I tend to give quite a bit of fertilizer to, and I just sort of, dribble it around the base here so that the leaves and the roots there can try and absorb as much as possible. So there is another context for liquid fertilizer. And then our flowering specific fertilizer is when something is in spike. So this is my Oncidium sotuanum, which is a species. Oncidium has those beautiful small sort of pinky and orange flowers. It's the ancestor of all the twinkle hybrids, one of the ancestors. So as you can see, these flowers are still a way off from opening yet. The spike is still growing, so it's still using a lot of energy from the pseudobulbs here. So this is the perfect time to be using a fertilizer that is aimed at blooming. And ditto for something like this. This is my Cymbidium here, which has got its flower spike coming here. That is the perfect time to be giving an orchid a fertilizer that is focused on flowering. But also, though, I would use the generic all-purpose fertilizers, liquid fertilizers at that point, because again, the orchid is using a lot of energy from its pseudobulbs to allow those flowers to occur. And when you have the tiniest little flower spike just starting to show, just starting to emerge, would also be the time to really start getting into the flower specific fertilizer, because it can really help that spike mature and to optimize the number of flowers that you might get on each spike. Oh my goodness, plant lovers, are you exhausted? Goodness me. Anyway, fertilizing is something I feel that as orchid growers, particularly when we're just beginning, you can get your knickers in quite a knot about. And I think I'm here to tell you from my experience, relax. If all you do is use a general all-purpose liquid fertilizer like this, you will have no problem. I wouldn't get too het up on the amount of potassium and nitrogen unless you really want to focus on blooms, in which case just get a blooming specific orchid fertilizer if you can see that your plant is coming into spike or its spike is starting to emerge. But so saying, yeah, this would do just as well because it has those elements that the flowering plant is going to need as well. So I think the moral of my story is just to relax, to take a step back and just think, what are the basic needs that this plant will have? And they are essentially for good basic nutrition, like all of us. So I wouldn't worry too much. So saying, wherever you are, your climate and your way of growing things might dictate that plants need very specific feeding regimes. And we all figure out what's right for us in our climate with our plants. So these are the things that have worked for me. But I would say there was an overarching end note, maybe just to relax a little bit about the fertilizer. I think other things are more important. Love, but also light, water and air quality. I think they're probably more important than the fertilizer. As long as you don't over fertilize something, you're going to be fine. And as long as you don't fertilize something when it's not growing, which is kind of obvious, you're also going to be fine. So there we are, plant lovers. I hope you have enjoyed my fertilizing 101. I hope it's made sense. These are all just things I've learned and picked up from my orchid growing. So as I said, please take it with a grain of salt, but if it's of any use to you, if your setup is similar to mine, then I hope it has been useful. Well, what we will do next week, I do not know. I need to go and have a lie down now. My partner, the good doctor, who is a respiratory specialist, will be outraged that I have put worm juice into his Riedel, anyway, those glasses into his tumblers. So I have to get rid of the evidence before I'm discovered. So don't tell anyone. Anyway, I will drink to you and look forward to seeing you next week. I hope your orchids are well fed and happy. And until then, take care.